Okay, we're live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Facilitating XYZ Live. My name is Sam Killermann, and I'm one of the co-hosts of this show, and I'm one of the co-creators of Facilitating XYZ, which is a free online resource for all facilitators. This show is a part of that resource, and this week we're really excited to be doing the second season of these shows, and this is our third episode of the second season. We're recording them all this week, and today we have our special guest, Amy Climer. I'm going to have everybody introduce themselves, and right now I'll have Meg introduce herself.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning, or good morning in my time, not in afternoon in y'all's, and who knows, around the world. Yesterday we were talking into the future, so that was exciting. And like Mark Collins said, it is gray and cloudy. So I am one of the other co-hosts of this show and one of the co-facilitators of Facilitating XYZ and one of the co-authors of Unlocking the Magic of Facilitation, which is a book kind of exploring unlocking the magic of facilitation. And that is what I think this show is trying to do even more is get into talking with other facilitators about their magic tricks, kind of what they do to help groups kind of unlock their potential or creativity, and really excited to get to learn from Amy today. And we're gonna just get right into it. So Amy, welcome. Wondering if you could just kick us off by telling us a little bit about you.
Sure. Thanks for having me on the show. It's good to be here.
Yeah.
So I am a speaker, facilitator, trainer. I teach people how to be more creative and innovative. I have a company called Climer Consulting, and I work with all sorts of groups, anything from like healthcare organizations, technology firms, summer camps, colleges and universities. It really runs the gamut, which I love. I like that diversity. But yeah, kind of my focus area is facilitating creativity, particularly. Do you want me to go more depth?
Well, yeah, I'm just curious. So that's you just even mentioned it, like that's really wide gamut, right? And a lot of people tend to have more of a niche. Where did you start in more of a niche and then expand out? Or have you always done facilitation with such a broad range of populations?
I would say my niche is more like my topic area versus the populations. And so it did start more narrow in that I guess it was mostly starting working for college. So I worked for University of Wisconsin and doing student affairs and outdoor education work. So mostly with either college students or staff professional development. And then I also worked on ropes courses or challenge courses, which is a wide range of people who show up. And that's where I started doing anything from, like youth programs to college students to corporate groups would come in. Corporate meaning like sort of an adult professional group.
Okay.
Yeah. And so kind of started, working with all these different types of groups. And what I realized is they're all the same. And they're all people, whether they are working for a healthcare, hospital, or they're creating software. There's a lot of similarities. So that's kind of how I ended up working with a lot of different types of people.
So you mentioned like starting or kind of, would you say that you got your start in facilitation in higher ed, or was it a different context that you started in?
I would say it was kind of higher ed / outdoor education. So I guess my first sort of exposure to facilitation and what that meant was in high school. I went on an Outward Bound course. And so it was 16 days in the mountains of North Carolina, backpacking, rock climbing, canoeing, did an overnight solo. And that's when I first saw like this power of like a facilitated conversations and seeing like what could come from it. Like, oh yeah, great. We had this really tough day backpacking, but then we had these really in-depth, interesting conversations at night where we started like pulling all this stuff out, or the instructor started pulling this stuff out of us. And that was really cool, especially because when we showed up, there was 12 of us on the course. I was the only person that wanted to be there. Like everybody else was like sent by either a judge or a parent or a principal said you have to go or we're going to kick you out of school. And by the end of the 16 days, like nobody wanted to go home. So to me, that was like really powerful to see to see that. So then after that outward bound experience, I went to college. I went to University of North Carolina in Charlotte, and they have a really strong outdoor program that I thought of as like my second major, even though it was, you know, co-curricular. I wasn't getting any credit for it. But basically by my junior and senior year, I was leading all these weekend trips for other students. So taking them backpacking, climbing, canoeing, whatever. And the philosophy of that program was very similar to Outward Bound. So it wasn't so much about like, hey, let's go rock climbing and have fun. I mean, that was definitely a goal, but then it was also, what else? What did you learn from this experience, as opposed to just, oh, I learned how to rock climb. So that's kind of how I got into that. And then after college, I worked for a few outdoor education organizations, like leading wilderness trips. And then I ended up at the University of Wisconsin, where I kind of got more of an exposure to higher education and student affairs. And so had a few different roles there. So learn more.
Yeah.
In that context, yeah.
Cool.
Awesome.
So you were just a participant in the Outward Bound program, right? You were saying you were a participant, but it was your first exposure to facilitation in the sense of as a participant?
Yeah, that was my first exposure as a participant. Although, like the very last day of the trip, I remember, like, you know, we had some closing circle, and I remember saying, I want to come back someday as an instructor. And it took me a really long time. It was like 20 years later. I finally got to work with Outward Bound again. So a few years ago, I started working with them. Just kind of cool.
It's pretty cool. Do you ever reflect back? Do you ever reflect back? Are there experiences you've had that maybe were facilitation experiences that were pre-Outward Bound? Like when you look back, you're like, oh wow, that actually was maybe an experience that led to me being interested in this?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, you know, I was certainly involved in a lot of activities as a kid. I mean, I played soccer all growing up, and I was in this thing, I don't even know if they still have it. It was through the YMCA, and it was called Indian Guides or Indian Princesses. Like, so like a horrible name. It was sort of like the YMCA's version of Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. But it was very outdoor focused. Like we were camping all the time and you know, doing like outdoor stuff. But it was a father-daughter thing. And so it was led by the dads. So I mean, it wasn't facilitation in the sense of like, hey, let's get together and have a conversation. And what did you learn? But definitely had a lot of exposure to, I mean, in some ways, I guess you're being facilitated, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then just, you know, experiences in school but nothing like in the sense that I think of as like classic facilitation.
Mm-hmm.
Got it.
Yeah.
One question I have is, when me and Sam both started doing facilitation, like Sam, as we kind of mentioned before the call, like started doing an orientation, and there's orientation leader training, right? And I'm wondering, when you started doing facilitation, whether it was at Wisconsin or like leading those trips, like, did you ever have somebody who was like, this is how you do this stuff? Or was it very like experiential, like, oh, that's how you have a good conversation? My co-leader did a really good job. Did you ever do any sort of like formal training?
Yes. Yeah. So at UNC Charlotte, this outdoor program I was in, it's called Venture. And I think, yeah, there was definitely some formal training. I mean, we had like staff training, like, okay, you want to lead a trip, or if you want to work on the ropes course, there's, you know, a weekend training that you have to do. And then there was a ton of like professional development. So I got involved my sophomore year because I transferred in. I went to another school my freshman year, but transferred in my sophomore year. I immediately got involved. And by my senior year, I had done like every single training they offered. And led just about every trip they offered. What was that, Sam?
Nice. What were the trainings focused on, like the content of, was there a lot of like just safety and things like that? Was it process oriented? Like, here's how you ask good questions, or here's how you like engage a group? Was it both those things? I'm curious. Yeah. Like what went into that training?
It was definitely both.
Okay.
And since we're talking about facilitation, I'll focus on that. I mean, I think that's where I first learned like the experiential learning cycle, you know, having an experience, reflecting, processing it, you know, applying it. And we were pretty intentional about trying to use that. And also kind of that model of the what, so what, now what, as far as the debrief goes. I don't remember if I learned those specific terms then, but definitely was exposed to that concept of like, okay, how do you lead a good debrief? What's the progression there? And then after every single, weekend trip that I led, or if I was facilitating a ropes course or whatever, they did a great job of setting up feedback opportunities. So would debrief the trip. And so there'd be multiple trip leaders, usually 3 of us, and then a professional staff. And then we were always giving each other feedback. And so it was so cool because I was able to see like, oh, I did that really well. I'm going to do it again. Or that was a complete disaster. Let's talk through like what I could do next time. And so it just allowed me to grow really fast, I think, as a facilitator. And all that being said, I still left my, my senior year not that good because, you're 21 and you can only be so good. Especially, 20 years later when you realize, oh, I really wasn't that good.
But at the time, you're like, I am like God's gift to facilitation.
Oh, yeah, whatever.
That was just me. Maybe that was
that was just you, Meg.
We all thought Meg was God's gift to facilitation when we were 21.
Exactly.
Remember that moment. 21st birthday. Oh, I
Oh,
just had this new realization.
I got on fast.
Yeah, right.
So I'm wondering, so that's really cool. And I would love to, later in the conversation, dig into that feedback piece. I think that's so interesting how that makes such a difference. But one of my other questions before kind of we get into that would be like, was there any other points after college where you did any sort of like formal facilitator training or like felt like, oh, this is where I'm really like cutting my teeth in this process of like becoming a better facilitator? Was there anything after college, or was that kind of like the last time there was like a formal?
No, there's definitely more. So about a year after college, I started working for this wilderness adventure program. They're called Adventure Pursuits. I don't think they exist anymore. But anyway, it was based in Colorado, and over the course of the summer, I led 3 wilderness trips for teenagers. Like, I think the longest one was 21 days. And that involved like a 10-day staff training that, some of it was about the safety piece, but a lot of it was just about, managing groups and processing and facilitation and that kind of thing. And then just remembering the summer, I mean, there were some kind of small disasters, which, pretty typical, not like, physical injury disasters, but just, facilitation disasters. And you just learn from those, at least if you're reflective, which I try to be. Yeah. And then a couple years after, I guess about a year after that, I went to University of New Hampshire and I got my master's degree in outdoor education. And there's also a big focus on, I don't remember if I took a class on facilitation per se, but that was sort of woven into a lot of the classes of just understanding like the theory and philosophy around experiential education and that processing. I think I did take a class that was something like, had the term processing in the title. I don't know. But anyway, there was a lot of training there. Yeah. And yeah, I think after that, I mean, just like going to conferences like Association for Experiential Education conferences and, just sitting in these different workshops and learning from people who are, 15, 20 years advanced from me, ahead of me, and learning from them. And I don't know, I feel like I kind of am always trying to like soak stuff up and how can I learn more? How can I get better? So I feel like I seek that out to some degree.
Yeah, we'll definitely want to dive into that later because it's something that Meg and I have noticed when we started Facilitating XYZ. A lot of people who do facilitation don't have much formal training in the facilitation side. They might be given a binder that has all of the, whatever lingo or terms of their discipline or like the outcomes that they're supposed to reach, but not really much attention to the process. So
interesting.
I would also like to just like bookmark that to come back to you later. What I'd like to ask you about is if you can tell us more about like your job now. So Climer Consulting, What's like a week look like for you, an average week or an average month? Is there no such thing as a normal week or month? Like, tell us about the work that you're doing now.
Okay, yeah. I don't think there is such thing as like a normal week or normal day or month. But because it does vary. Like actually this month in May, when we're recording, it's for me, it's been more of a kind of a development month. Like I'm in the office more and, you know, looking ahead. And then next month, June, it's like every single week I'm leading something. So I'll just give you an example. Like next month, doing two different, like the first 2 weeks, 1 week I'm leading a staff training for a summer camp in Michigan. And it's just a short, you know, their staff training, I don't know how long it is, maybe 5 days. And I'm going in just to do a half-day program to teach them how to use creativity and use the creative problem-solving process. And it's actually a little bit of, you know, it's a cycle similar to the experiential learning cycle. And so I teach them this cycle and how to be more intentional about being creative. My belief, and this is backed up by research, is that we all have really this incredible capacity to be creative, but we don't really always use it. You know, I'm sure you heard people, and maybe you've even said yourself, like, oh no, I'm not creative, which is often followed up by a comment like, I can't draw. Well, yeah. In what I'm doing, those are completely different, separate skills. You could be highly creative and struggle with stick figures. And so I'm teaching people how to be more deliberate with that, with the creativity, because if you look at any highly creative, prolific person, you know, anything from like Einstein to Picasso or, you know, any realm, they have a process they're following to intentionally come up with ideas and develop those ideas and implement them. And so I teach people that process. So I'm doing that with a summer camp. I've done that with a number of summer camps around the country. The following week, I'm going to Wisconsin, and I'm facilitating a keynote for a restaurant franchise. It's like all the franchise owners are coming together. So there's like a couple hundred people, and they wanted like a team building keynote. So we're doing 200 people, this activity called Marshmallow Challenge. I don't know if you know that activity. Yeah, there's a TED talk on it. Anyway, yeah, so I'm facilitating that with 200 people, and then really kind of just like pulling out. It will be like a 200-person facilitated conversation. Like they'll do the activity, and then we'll talk about, okay, what did you learn from it? What did you notice? And, you know, Mike's running around the room and that kind of thing. Cool. So, and that's kind of like a bigger, what's that?
So restaurant chain managers, like, so these are the people who are like they're all coming to this hub, but they're coming from this franchise from all over the States or whatever for this event. Yeah, that's a very peculiar group. Okay, I like that. Yeah. Some of them are managers. Some of them own the different franchise locations. Okay. I think it'll be a mix of people. I've worked with them before, not the full group, but I've worked with their executive team, and they're really fun, like just really awesome company. So cool. I'm kind of excited about that. Yeah. And then sometimes I do really small stuff. Like actually the same company, I've worked with their executive team. I think they've expanded their team, but they had just 4 people, and did like a half-day training for them. Not training, it really was more facilitation of helping them build trust and get to know each other. I mean, they knew each other well. I think the newest person was like 4 years he had been there. But they were kind of like, hey, how do we take this to the next level? And so I worked with them for a day and helped them with that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So you said like it really wasn't a training, it was more of a facilitation. I'm wondering if because when I work with new folks, like new clients or whatever, they often use training, presentation, facilitation, workshop, all interchangeably. Mm-hmm. How would you pull those two terms apart for people?
So I guess I would say like presentation, I think of like I'm giving you information, like I'm delivering something to you. It might be, a keynote speech is a great example of presentation. Whereas to me, like a facilitation is I'm there to kind of lead a conversation. And I might, at times steer it in certain directions or pull things out or dig in a little bit more. but I'm doing a lot less talking. If anything, maybe I'm answering some question, or I'm asking questions or summarizing, but really it's coming, the content and the body of the experience is coming from the group. For me, and I think this may be different for different people, but when I think of a training, I usually combine those two things. And so I'm doing some presentation, maybe I'll present for like 10 minutes, like here's a model, or here's a philosophy or theory I want you to know, or here's a concept or a method or whatever it is. And then let's start practicing that. Let's dive into that. And that might be setting up some sort of activity where they can practice that. Sometimes, like if I'm just presenting a theory or philosophy that they might start using, and it might just be more of a conversation of like, okay, what have you seen this in action before? What does that look like? So that's my, I guess, training style, is to combine the presentation and the facilitation together.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it totally does. That's a perfect description of it. And I think that, I don't know, Meg, if this is why you're asking the question, but for me, it's kind of a pain point of trying to communicate that to clients or to people who don't necessarily hold those differences, because I'm not sure if they know what they're asking for, or if I give them what they're asking for, if they're actually going to be happy afterwards. Like if they ask for a presentation, but what they really wanted was a training, and they just didn't have the nuance of language to specifically ask for that. So I find myself like pushing back a lot and trying to like tease that out. So yeah, and I hold those as pretty much the exact same as you do.
The same definitions, you mean?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would describe all the three, and even like my training style as being the same, with like combination of facilitation and presentation. Mm-hmm. When you are, so the group that you're doing, that's the first group that you're doing, is that going to be like a training of trainers, or is it like you're going there to do that creativity cycle, or creative process cycle? What did you call it?
Creative problem solving process.
Creative problem solving process. So you're doing that work. Is that with people who are then going to lead that discussion with others, or are you doing that work directly with like the youth or directly with the participants?
It's a little bit of both. So in this particular situation, so the participants are all summer camp counselors. And so I'm introducing the model to them, the process to them, and giving them a bunch of tools and techniques that they can use, that they can then start using with their campers. Their focus is kind of like, how do we empower our campers more? And so part of this is just to give them more tools, and then also to help the counselors know how to come up with more ideas. So
cool.
We're not together long enough for them to, it's not really facilitator training. They're going to get, some little things they can use, but it's not, I would say, well, I'll probably need like 2-3 days to really get into how to facilitate this process, which, maybe that's next year.
Yeah. Something I think that actually happens a lot, but I hadn't really separated in my mind. So like when me and Sam do train the trainers, we are literally like giving them a curriculum and then helping them learn how to facilitate that curriculum. And to me, like, and like, doing the, not just the content, but the how of the process, right? And I would say like, that's like the farthest on this side of a train the trainer model, right? Is like, you are going to be us in 2 days,
right?
Yeah. And then all the way over here is just like, I just want you to have a participant experience, right? And I think I often think of those as like two completely separate circles, right? But I think that there's a lot of programming that ends up being kind of in the middle, which is what I heard you describing, which is that like you have people who are going to use what you're teaching them, but they're not going to be teaching other people what you're teaching them. You're just kind of bringing out, like you're giving them tools and perspectives as a facilitator to inform their practice, right? But it isn't just to inform them as participants. It's like, there is another step removed. So I'm starting to see that more as like a Venn diagram, where the middle is a lot of what, like, it's like facilitator, or it's training of trainers, not training the trainers. I don't know if that language makes sense, but
like what article or preposition or whatever the English label is. Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's almost like a continuum, I think of it as.
Yeah, that's
Mhm.
Yeah, because I feel like what I'm doing, with this summer camp, I'm not doing train the trainers. I'm not training, it's not facilitator training.
Right.
But it's like, yeah, I'm going to teach you like this simple, easy way you can use Post-it notes to generate ideas. It's so easy that I would hope you would repeat it later. Like, you don't need any special training to use this, Yeah, it's kind of like, you go to a workshop and you see an activity, and you're like, oh, I'm totally going to use that activity in the future. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, sometimes you don't need that. And the famous, we've had this come up in a couple of FacilitatingXYZ live interviews, but like the famous one that I think is the easiest activity to just see done is like, the how do you grip your hands or how do you fold your arms one?
Yep.
And then like, oh, now do it the other way. Does that feel uncomfortable? Okay, we're going to be digging into some discomfort. Like that's one where there's no manual for that. There's no training trainers for that. It's just something that's so helpful and so easy that you're like, anybody can apply it. Huh, okay. So could you give us the 1,000-foot sketch of the the process that you're sharing with those participants, or the process that you generally share with people when it comes to this so your podcast is called Deliberate Creative, right? Deliberate creativity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So the process that I use is called creative problem solving. It's been around since like the late 40s, and it's cool because there's been a lot of research on it, and all this research that shows this works. That if you want to be more creative, follow this process and you'll be more creative. And so anyway, the basic overview is you start out, and I feel like I want to draw. Oh, I wonder if I can, let me see if I can make this work.
Heck yeah.
Oh,
love it.
Uh-oh, I totally just lost you.
Oh, we didn't lose you. You're still good.
Oh yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, something happened. I lost my monitor. Oh, I see. Hold on a minute.
Oh, you lost your monitor, but not the webcam. Got it.
Okay, maybe this was a bad idea.
Hey,
on our end, it
this
looks great.
Problem-solving process. Yep.
Okay, you're gonna see another part of my room really quick.
Okay.
That's my partner's messy desk.
A tour. Now I know what you define as messy. That's good to know.
Yep, exactly. That's what I was just thinking. We can dig into that in a little bit.
Yeah, right. Okay, I see you now. Okay, let me try that again. Okay, can you kind of see over here?
Yeah,
yeah, probably like 2/3.
Okay.
Or half.
Yeah.
The right side.
I'm excited.
Okay. So, can you see that?
Where the yes.
Okay.
The marker's really.
Let me get a darker marker.
Old one. Okay. Yeah.
How's that?
Visible.
Yep, I can see it.
Okay. Maybe this is a bad idea.
No. Try it out.
Okay. All right. So we start off at the top. We have clarify. Oh, it might be reversed.
Nope.
No, it's not. It's good.
Okay, cool. So clarify is like the first stage of the process where, what are you trying to be creative with? So say you're like, hey, what else can we do with facilitating XYZ? And how can we push this to the next level or be more creative with it? And so you have to really clarify, what is it you're trying to be creative with? Is it the video per se, or is it this entire concept, this whole organization? And you start digging in, and really the clarify could be a long process. I recently worked with a government team, a team in the federal government that wanted to do some strategic planning, but they wanted to be more creative. And in general, I don't really do strategic planning, but they said, well, but we want to be more creative in the work we're doing. I'm like, okay. We spent a day and a half on the clarify stage.
Okay.
So, yeah. And if you're anything like me, you're like, oh my God, a day and a half, that sounds horrible. It was a little painful at times. This is not my favorite stage. Okay. The next stage is ideate. And so this is like what people think of when they think of creativity. So this is where we come up with ideas. And this actually can be pretty fast. I think, if we use the same example with this government team, it was a 3-day process. We probably spent half a day on ideate at most. So But sometimes it does need longer. It just sort of depends on what the challenge is. Okay, so then what happens, oh, let me back up. At the end of the clarify stage, your goal is to have a specific challenge question. And you go into the ideate stage with that question.
Can you give us an example of what a specific challenge question might sound like?
Yeah. How might we make facilitating XYZ like the most amazing facilitator resource ever?
Okay.
Okay,
Cool.
that's actually not the best one, but you get the idea. Okay, so we have this, and that how might we is a very intentional phrase, as opposed to like how will we or how would we. By using the word might, it just implies this sense of possibility.
Okay.
So we go into the, does that make sense?
Yeah. Are there any other phrases, or is like how might we the clutch one?
No, there's a handful. There's probably like 6 to 10. In what ways might we? I'm blanking on them now.
That's okay. So there's other ways, but like it's leaving that possibility. That's the really big part.
Exactly. Okay, so then in the ideate stage, you could generate hundreds of ideas, which is overwhelming, and some of them will be bad. There are such thing as bad ideas. You just don't decide right then they're bad. But then you take those ideas and you pick your best ones. Say we have 3 good ideas. And then you go into the next stage, which is develop. So develop is where we take those 3 ideas and you develop them further. And you figure out like, okay, are these worth exploring more? Because when the idea comes out, I mean, it's like on a Post-it note, that's it. So that's not a very well developed or defined idea. And so you need to push it a little further to see, how do we expand this? Does this make sense?
Yep.
Okay, cool. All right, so then from develop, you implement. And so you take those ideas in the develop stage that, once they've been fleshed out a little bit more, and then you start implementing. And obviously the implementation could be very long. It could be weeks, months, years. But at a certain point, you also are it's a cycle. So you're gonna want to go back through, so you're going around.
Perfect.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
Are you in your process, or like when you're working with a group, are you basically taking them through the first 3 stages, and then when you leave, you're like, and now it's up to implementation? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And it kind of depends on the situation. Sometimes we focus more on even just the first 2. Like we often barely get to develop, depending on how much time and all those details. But yeah, usually I leave them on their own for develop or for implement.
Is there are there frameworks that you tend to use when it comes to the clarifying the clarifying the problem or clarifying the creative challenge? And then are there different frameworks or facilitation strategies that you use for ideate? Do you have go-tos, or do you tend to just respond to different group needs?
I would say it's a little bit of both. I guess one thing I should add is that all of us have preferences for one or more of the stages. So okay. I love ideating, and I also enjoy implementing. I struggle with clarify, and I struggle with develop, which also means as a facilitator, I like, let's ideate, come on. And I know I can't do that. And so as a facilitator, I feel like I have to put more energy and work into the clarify, both in preparing it and in facilitating it. Okay. So in some ways I'm like, oh, if you want me to talk about ideate, I can just ramble on and on. And then for clarify, I'm like, oh, I have to look at my notes. But I'll just give you like an example of one activity or framework that I would use. Yeah,
that's great.
So anytime you're trying to look at making changes, there's assumptions that you hold, right? That like you have certain assumptions about facilitation XYZ, right? So if you're trying to push that and explore it further, an activity is you can make these 2 lists. One is a list of everything you know, so KNOW, And the next is a list of what you wonder. So like the no wonder list. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And sometimes what happens is there's some like ahas that come out of those lists. And something that like Meg would say, well, this is what I know. And then Sam, you might be like, oh, I don't know if that's true or not. And so then you kind of get to like push a little bit into, well, what are assumptions and what is actually fact? And you know, maybe you turn some of those no's into a wonder. And so that can help kind of push and figure out like, well, what is it we're actually trying to do here?
Yeah.
So
That's great. And
yeah.
then what would be an activity or like a framework that you would tend to use with Ideate? We'll let you talk about your favorite one.
Sweet. Well, most people, one thing that I avoid is I don't do the classic brainstorming, because most people have done that. You know, most people know how to do it. Most people have had bad experiences with it. Sometimes I get into why it doesn't work. But I try to give them some alternative ways to generate ideas, especially in a group setting. So one thing is just like everybody gets a little stack of Post-it notes, and which I have some here. So everyone gets like their stack of Post-it notes and like a thin marker, like a Sharpie or like a thick pen, basically. And they just, yes, there you go. And they like get to write like one idea per Post-it note, and they just like start generating this pile of notes, right, that they have. And then they start sharing those, and then those get plastered on the wall. And you can do it in a number of ways, some ways that are more anonymous, some that are less, but either way, the ideas get presented to the group so that they're like the group's ideas. They're not Sam's ideas or Meg's or Amy's, like, because if we start owning the ideas, it causes more problems. Sure. We want them to be owned by the group. So I usually start with that, but then at a certain point, it just dries up. Like people are just staring at the wall, like, I don't know, I don't have any more ideas, which is just a normal part of the process. So then I introduced this product, this tool that I made. I don't know if you can see these Climer cards.
Yeah, Climer cards. Okay.
Yeah, have you seen these, Sam?
No, I haven't. I'm excited.
So they're this deck of cards that I created, and let me see if I can like do this on the video. They just like have all these images, and they're all little paintings that I did. And so what I do is I lay these all out on the table, and then I say, okay, looking at the images, now what ideas do you get for the challenge? Do you know what I mean? And then, you know, it could be something really literal, or it could be something more metaphoric. You know, they like, I don't know, maybe the eyeball makes them think of light or insight, and then, you know, that spurs something else. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter what card they get the idea from, as long as they're getting more ideas. Okay. So that's kind of the next thing I do. Usually. Okay,
so at that point, so you've noticed the ideas are starting to dry up, so you use an activity to try to pull more ideas. Are those new ideas? Are they held in a different regard, or are they just put up on the wall with all the other ideas?
No, we just throw them all up together. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
There's this idea of the third in creativity, where the first third of the ideas that you get, like that come out, they just be like so normal, like anybody kind of, it's like, okay, we're looking at a new marketing strategy, social media. It's going to come up, right? Like, this is not creative unless you're, you know, now you could push it. And
what do you mean social media? Tell me more about this idea you've had.
What is the Facebook?
Right. Yeah. What is this YouTube thing?
Should we go viral? Is that an idea? Should we go viral?
Yeah, let's go viral. Yeah, great idea. Yeah, so there's like this first third of ideas that is, you know, anyone probably would have, right? And then it starts getting a little better. And generally it's the third where it's like, oh, that's cool. No one's thought of that before. And so that's why you keep pushing to generate more and more ideas. I think a lot of people, when they're brainstorming or their experiences in the past, they've brainstormed and they think 10, 15 ideas is enough. And I'm thinking, no, like 300 to 500 ideas. Let's see if we can get that, you know, get that far.
Okay. That's part of why I was asking if you hold them separate, right? Is based on that idea or that theory. So you do this other activity to keep pulling out. Is there a so if that doesn't work, do you have like a third strategy to like really just make sure? Yeah.
I mean, there's dozens. Yeah,
Okay,
I mean,
cool.
we could do like an entire day of just ideation techniques, like a new one every 20 minutes.
Okay, so that's like a tool that you just have in your belt. Like you're just going to keep trying. So you've got the Climer cards and other like activities that are just based around this ideation of just the generating ideas. Okay, is there another like phase? Do you, once you've got all these ideas, do you then shift into, do you see any value in like categorizing them? Do you, yeah?
Yeah. So a lot of times that's the next step is we'll categorize them. And so, all the social media ideas go together or whatever, people will, that's up to the group. They'll try to see those categories. And then it's selecting the best ones. And so kind of depending on the challenge, it might be like an entire category, but usually it's like an idea within the category. Because inevitably in the category, there's going to be some ideas either that aren't that creative, they're already been done, they're not going to work, whatever. The entire process is making lists and making choices, making like over and over, like going through that process again and again. There are times I think where it can get a little bit tedious if you don't, keep it interesting and, engaging, but yeah, so then you select the best ideas from that massive pile of 300. Now, sometimes you could do that as you go because analyzing 300 to 400 ideas might just be overwhelming. And so maybe, after you've done, 20 minutes of ideas, you're like, all right, let's just take a few moments, read through all these, pull out the top 10, and we'll carry those over. And then you're doing that again and again, so that at the very end, maybe you only have, 100 ideas or 50 ideas that you're looking at instead of all of them at once.
Cool.
Is there a way, so I was talking to somebody recently and they were like, I'm really not a fan of dot voting, right? Where everybody has like a say, because what it does is just recreate like the majority rules, basically. Is there any way that you prevent like a good but out there idea from getting lost in the shuffle where everyone's like, oh yeah, well, let's do these 10. And you're like, those 3 are really interesting. And there's 2 people who are excited about it and 15 people who are wrong in not being excited about it. Like, how do you prevent the good ideas from getting lost in the like creative shuffle of the majority?
Or it's like a cult of personality, right? Like if somebody who's really like holds a lot of clout in that space is advocating for an idea, people might be like, well, if Meg likes it, we should all like it because Meg is God's gifts to facilitation.
Which we already determined. Sorry, Meg.
Sorry, I'm done with that one.
I'm
just excited about the answer.
Well, I think it's a really good question. I've definitely dealt with that before. So one of the things that I do is I use dot voting. I mean, you can use it as a majority rules, and sometimes that's fine. There's a time and place for that. But sometimes I just use it as a way to get everything in the bucket. And so it doesn't matter if it has 1 dot or 10 dots, it counts.
Got it.
You know what I mean? And so we're not saying that this idea is better, like the idea with 10 dots, but it's just that, or I guess that gives an opportunity for the idea that only has 1 dot to kind of be included, And then it's really about, that might be where you develop it further. So I think sometimes, depending on the group and the type of people, they're going to vote for an idea that they know will work because that's what they're comfortable with. They can imagine how it might unfold. But then there might be an idea that there's one person who can see how it would unfold and see how it would work, and the rest of the group's like, I don't get it. That makes no sense to me. And so then in the development stage, that's where you can kind of take that idea and push it further, and that person can, gets to talk more about like how they envision that idea happening. And then people can add to it and, keep sculpting it. Because, again, it's like it starts out and it's only a sentence on a Post-it note, which is not that, you're not going to implement that.
So that pops a couple of thoughts into my mind. Do you find that people really want to like move to different phases of this cycle, like when it may not be appropriate yet. So you're still clarifying the problem and people start shouting out ideas, or during the ideate stage, people start to like develop ideas instead of just ideating. And how, if so, how do you, or do you like corral them back and say, we'll get to that in a bit? Do you use parking lots? Like, how do you do that?
Yeah, it happens all the time, and it is a challenge. I guess a couple kind of things I've seen consistently are, okay, so say we're in the ideate stage and we do a round of Post-it notes. And usually what happens is, I guess it depends on the group. Sometimes people will be working at a table. So there might be, 25 people in the room and they're each at a table of 5. And they go around, they've all shared their Post-it notes. There's a pile on the table and there's still time left in the activity. And so they'll start talking about the ideas. And so, and that's the developed stage. They're like, or sometimes they're just talking about other stuff. But if they're talking about the ideas, I generally say, okay, that's your first round, keep going. And I really push them like to don't talk about the idea. There will be time later for that. Just like go as fast as you can and see, how many ideas you can get out. As bad as they might be, it doesn't matter initially. So that's one thing. Yeah, sometimes in the clarify stage, people want to start getting into ideas. And if they do, I just, here's your pile of Post-it notes. Like, you hang on to this and you just kind of keep that in your pocket. That's cool. I don't want to hold you back, but don't interrupt the rest of the process.
Cool.
Yeah. Usually people are pretty cool with it, especially when I explain how we all have preferences for one or more areas. And yeah.
Sweet. Okay.
Is the process different with groups that are 4 versus 25?
It can be. Well, I mean, the general process is the same. So I guess not really. It's more in the nuances. Depending on the group, a group of 4 might really struggle with coming up with ideas, especially if they're not strong ideators. And so that sometimes what'll happen in a process is, say there are 4 people. Say it's like, I don't know, a project, a team that's like, come together to work on a certain project, or it's an executive team or whatever. They might do all the clarify by themselves. They come out with their question. And then for the ideate, they open it up to a lot more people. And they get all these ideas, and then they take them and they go back by themselves and they pick the best ones, they develop them, and then usually they'll come back for implementation because, depending on the project, if it's an organization, usually it's not just 4 people implementing it. But the whole process does not need to be done by everybody. And I think it's, having 25 people do clarify can be a small disaster. And I have made that mistake. Yeah. So sometimes smaller is better. Sometimes bigger is better.
Cool. Dang, this is so helpful. Thank you for walking us through that.
Yeah, I love it. I could talk all day about it.
and do.
That's great. Amy, have there been like resources? So I know, so I've read a lot about creativity, and it's become kind of, I don't know if it's a buzzword, but it's definitely something that like a lot of different industries are getting into. Are there resources that you really cherish, like that have helped you shape this process or helped inform your work in like creative facilitation?
Yeah, probably one of the best resources for me has been a conference called the Creative Problem Solving Institute. And it happens every June in Buffalo, New York. It's kind of an interesting conference because it's a little bit more of like a training / a conference. And so you show up like your first year and you go through a 3-day training. And then your next year you go through like the next level training and, so forth. But then there's still also opportunities for like the random workshop where you can, you get to choose. And so I've been 2 years as a participant, and then the 3rd year, this last year that I went, I was teaching like the introductory class. It's an amazing, amazing resource. Probably, I would guess about 600 people go. Yeah, and it's a blend of people who are like never done this stuff to people who are like icons in the field, and they've been doing this for 30 years, and yeah.
Right.
So that's fun. And then there's a ton of books. feel like I should look at my bookshelf.
If you can't look at like if you can't think of them off the top of your head, like maybe email us later, or I can kind of follow up with you on that question.
Okay.
If nothing jumps to mind, if anything jumps to mind, like feel free. But
Yeah.
Well, and actually, I think it was last week, I put up a blog post on my website of like my top 6 creativity books.
Cool. We'll link to that.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah. And then, I mean, another resource that I have is I have a podcast that I do. It's called The Deliberate Creative. And there's 69 episodes right now. It's been going for about 2 years. And sometimes I'll interview people who are an expert in a certain area. And then sometimes I'm just talking and teaching about something related to creativity. But the whole premise of the podcast is to teach people how to lead innovation in teams. So there's a few episodes that are just about facilitation. And I think it's a good resource.
Cool.
Amy, what facilitation techniques have you found that have maybe you've learned or you found have been really useful in hosting that podcast? Like what have you learned, or what did you realize you needed to learn, I guess? So Meg and I, in the meta facilitation of this, like we do all these debriefs and we're like, wow, this is such a different skill than facilitation. I'm wondering if you feel that's the same, and if so, you can share some learning with us.
Well, I definitely want to ask you that question as well, because y'all are doing a great job of asking me questions. I think one of the things that I really learned is to, I don't know, I guess a little bit of like letting go of perfectionism, which I thought about a lot more when I first started the podcast, because I'm like, oh my gosh, this is going to be recorded. This, people can listen to this for forever. I want to make sure it's really good. And so like the very first episode, I think I re-recorded it like 5 times.
Was it just with you or with a guest?
No, it's just me.
Oh. Hey, we need to do that interview again. Take 2.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no. That poor guest, that'd be terrible. No, it was just me. And then after a while, I was like, whatever. People want to hear the occasional they don't need it to be perfect, and that's way too much work anyway. Like, what am I not doing by trying to make that perfect? Like, what other work am I not doing? So definitely letting go of a little perfectionism. I made a lot of mistakes. Like, I've had multiple, not many, but a few interviews where I've had to cancel because of tech issues on my end. I actually had one today I had to cancel because I don't know what's going on with my setup, but something's wrong. But I guess as far as the facilitation, I don't know. I mean, some of them are just me talking, and then others are interviews. And I feel like I've gotten better at the interviews as I've gone. I think I've just gotten more comfortable, and also got better at like preparing the person who was being interviewed, which I think you all have done a great job with that.
Can you explain that? So in the preparing the person part, what do you mean?
Well, just like helping them know what to expect.
Okay.
And like I send them emails ahead of time, and I tend to jump on a quick phone call with them at some point ahead of time now, which I didn't always do. I know you all have done that.
Not always.
Was that something you changed as you went on?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So I would ask you that same question. Like, what have you learned in facilitating this, I don't know, interview platform, podcast, whatever this is called?
That we don't know yet either. I think that's one of the things we love about Google Hangout is that it allows us to maybe use the content in lots of different ways. But so, I mean, I've learned a lot about this, the process of doing this, and I'm trying to think like what from facilitation have we brought in, and then also what goes out in the other direction. So the first thing that comes to mind, I'll speak to the in, and then if something else comes to mind, I'd love to know how this influences my facilitation. But so, like Sam said, we debrief after this because both of us want to get better. And something that we did yesterday, which I thought was really helpful, was we gave our debriefs a structure other than what worked and what didn't work. Mm-hmm. We basically said, like, here are the different things that we think create a successful show. And then go through those categories, right? And I think that would be, now going to the other end, I think that would be really helpful to do in my facilitations, right? So like, here are the 5 things that make for a great train the trainer, or make for an awesome 2-hour training, right? It's like, you know, energy and interest, investment, new ideas, and conflict coming to the surface, even if we don't, right? Like, and then going through like, okay, how did the energy management go? How did the idea generation go? I think that'd be super helpful. And I think has already been helpful just in doing the podcast, so, or the interview. So I think that's one way that is easily translated to facilitation that also deeply improves the our abilities on this platform. What do you think, Sam?
Yeah. Well, what's funny is, so Amy, I didn't have this creative problem solving process. I've never seen this somehow. I've managed to miss it in the entire world. And what's funny is I realized we were kind of doing this with, we were clarifying the challenge that we had for this podcast or for this show. And then the ideate was really like within those different challenges of like, how can we ask questions better, or manage the pace of the interview better, or create more structure to build upon. Like we really want to like build up into ideas, or get the guests talking about things that they maybe haven't talked about before. So how can we lay that structure early? And yeah, it's funny because we're ideating, and then we'll eventually be developing these ideas as we practice them and see if they work or don't, and we'll complete it, or as we implement them. So it's fun. But I would say the thing that has been the biggest difference between this and facilitation that I'm happy we've learned this lesson, and it's what led to us doing season 2 like this, is we had so much time between each show. I don't know what your pace is for your podcast, but we had about a month, maybe 2 sometimes between shows. And we found that we kept making the same mistakes and kept going through the same learning processes because we weren't doing it with enough frequency to really like incorporate that learning and implement that learning and then build from it. So the idea of binging this week is like our like finals week, or just we're trying to like pressure cook this to where we get an idea, we're forced to think through how might we do that better, and then 12 hours later or 24 hours later, we're giving it a shot, and then we get to go through this process again. And I really do think that it's going to help us after this week. We'll be or will, at least, even if people watching don't think we're better, I think that we'll feel much more comfortable doing this, or feel like we have a better grasp of it.
Yeah, and that's cool. I love that. I think I'm trying to think. Like, I feel like I have noticed that in my own work. I mean, I haven't done it like a bunch in one week like you're doing, but I think that's a really good idea. Like, this is going to be podcast recording week, and I'm going to do the next 6 months or the next 3 months or whatever. But I have found, yeah, like when I've done, I think at first I've had a couple of times where I've done 2 in one day, and I was like kind of nervous about it. Like, okay, do I have the energy for this? But it was the opposite. It was like the energy from the first one went into the second one, and so I love that idea.
I also think like in like going back to facilitation, like, you know, I did a workshop last week for the first time, and I have so many new ideas, right? Like it went okay, but like I have 100 more ideas to how to make the next one better. And I don't have a next one yet. So I'm like, like I'm just gonna have to make it happen. If someone doesn't, like, if I'm not hired to do it again, I'm gonna have to just make it happen, because I want to test those out before the energy I have around it goes away.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably a struggle for new facilitators. If you are doing something that you're really excited about and want to improve and learn from, but you're not doing it with the frequency enough that you can actually like iterate, that's really hard. I'm glad that when I started my facilitation like journey, I basically was able to do a safe zone every 3 weeks.
Yeah, I think I had the same experience in college, where it's like every single weekend I'm like facilitating this trip. And so, you know, Tuesday we would debrief, and then by Thursday I'm prepping for the next trip. And yeah, you just start getting better and better.
This is a perfect transition into, like, so you mentioned earlier, we wanted to talk about like that. We wanted to talk about your kind of the formal learning process that you had, and that we don't think a lot of facilitators do. So I wonder if we can switch gears and think about that. Like, so this is one element that's likely or was likely very helpful was the frequency, right? And for a lot of people who are self-taught, maybe like Meg, you were saying, maybe they're only doing facilitation once every 6 months. So that's going to be really difficult to grow in the craft. But Amy, I'm wondering, are there other things that you got through through the formal education, through the theory, through the like the group process stuff that you were doing, and even through the content? Are there particular things that stuck out to you as like, this was so important, or this was kind of like a big moment for me, and like, oh my gosh, I look back at before I knew this and after, and I was in like a night and day difference? Are there any things that stick out in that way that you got through that formal education?
I'm gonna just go with like the first thing that comes to my mind.
Yeah.
And it's not so much a specific thing, but I remember like in my master's degree learning about, more about like theories behind some of the practice. And, I understood before then like this general experiential education cycle, but like understanding the theory more and the philosophy behind it helped me like use it more like in the moment. So like before it was like, oh, okay, yeah, I know this cycle and it's like steps 1 through 4 and I should follow the steps, but I didn't always understand why. And I think for me, understanding the why helped me do the what and the how better. And that was like a little bit of an aha. And I don't know if how much of that's related just to like me and my personality and my learning style or whatever, and how much of that is just maybe general, like everyone needs, I'm not sure. I mean, there is the philosophy, like Simon Sinek, start with why. Like, the why is kind of the driver. So perhaps it's somewhat universal. But yeah, I feel like it helped me like own it more, and just it's one thing to like go through the motions, but then when you actually understand something, you can take it to the next level and the next level and the next level. And so that'd be one thing.
For sure. And so Meg, do you know that podcast, or not podcast, the TED Talk, Simon Sinek, start with why? Mm-hmm. Yeah. For anybody who's maybe on the fence about the theory, I think that would be a good TED Talk to watch to convince people. So in the theory, like learning the theory, that was something that you were provided in like a formal education that a lot of people probably, I can just say with certainty, a lot of people never will dig into if they're just like going through maybe they've got a packet with an activity or a curriculum. I think that's a good one. Are there thoughts on how people that you would have for how people might find that theory or be introduced to it or introduce themselves to it if they're not already getting it?
Mm-hmm. I think that everything in experiential education, which is this idea of like learning through experience, could probably be traced back to John Dewey, who is a educational philosopher in the 1930s, and actually even further. I mean, we had to read Plato in my master's program. But if we want to be a little bit more contemporary, we can go back to John Dewey. And there's this little skinny book called Experience and Education, and it's like 90 pages. It's dense. It is intense though. But if you are really serious, like I want to understand this stuff, go read that book. It's something he wrote a little later in his life, so it's a bit more of like a summary, and his theories I think were more well developed than earlier. At least that's my understanding. I haven't read a ton of his work, but that's like that's kind of the beginning. I think that there's a lot of other really good books about facilitation and experiential education and this idea of learning through experience that I think could be really helpful. Steve Simpson has a couple of good books. I think he's out of University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. But hold on.
Nice.
So like, here's one of his books. I don't know if you can see this, The Processing Pinnacle. And the subtitle is An Educator's Guide to Better Processing. So that's really about like the processing the conversation afterwards. That's a good one. This one's, I think, one of his more recent books. And it's kind of cool. A lot of it's written like in dialogue. Well, he'll have like well, here's what the conversation might have looked like, and here's what you might say or do. So that's kind of helpful. There's a bunch of other ones though. I could come up with a list and we could put them in the show notes.
Great. One question I have is, when I started exploring facilitation, like I would type in facilitator, like, book, or that would be a terrible Google search, but like I was looking for specific resources for facilitators, right? And I felt like there was not a lot of them. And that's like one of the, the motivations behind Facilitating XYZ is to help put these in the same place, and also to help kind of to give them to facilitators as like, this is a facilitator tool, or like, this is a facilitator resource. And a lot of books, like I'm excited to go out and like find these books now. But I'm wondering, when you read them, or when you read anything kind of new, and you're really looking at it from a facilitator perspective, when they're not talking exclusively about facilitation, right? They're talking about education, they're talking about experiential ed, which all has like, they're all, entangled in each other, but they're not exactly the same. Is there any way that you, like anything you look for, or any particular way that you, when you're reading a book that's for educators at large, that you try to hone in on, like, okay, this is how I can use this in my work as a facilitator?
I mean, I guess a lot of times when I'm reading a book, I am looking at, can I use this? And if so, how? And what if this resonates with me and what doesn't? And I just heard this idea yesterday, and I haven't done this myself. So, but this guy was talking about really developing your thought leadership, and which really is kind of like, how do you become a thought leader in anything, in facilitation or whatever? Like, how do you get really good at it? And it was from this guy, Matt Church, out of Australia. And so he says when he's reading a book, he has 2 legal pads on either side, and one at the top says yes and one of them says yes but. And so he'll make a list of like, these are all the things that like I totally agree with this, and here's what I might build on it. And then over here are the things that are like, okay, I can see that, but, and then like his, different perspective on that. And I thought, oh, that's a really cool way to take a text, especially with something you already know a fair bit about, and then you just like are digesting it in a different way, and like kind of bringing that into your own knowledge and taking it to the next level. Now I haven't done that, but it seemed like a really cool idea.
Yeah.
I also I do tend to use my books in the sense that like I write in the margins and I'll write questions to myself. Actually, the only way that I could get through John Dewey's Experience in Education is at the end of every single page, I wrote a 1-sentence summary of that page.
Nice.
And that, like, doing that helped me like really get the book really well, especially because, I mean, it's dense. I don't know if have you read it?
No.
No shame in that. No.
I have hesitation just because of how much you can't go to AE without hearing the name John Dewey every year, right? It's just not possible. And to be one of the people sitting in the audience, like, not only have I not read that book, I haven't read any John Dewey, like nothing. So maybe that's what my goal for before the conference next year will be, to read that book so I can walk in like, I got this. Like,
yeah, totally. I would bet you can get it on half.com for 75 cents. So that won't be a barrier.
I will yes and John Dewey.
There you go. For sure.
I love that. I think that's
great.
Do
you guys have any techniques that you use for like when you're digesting material or reading books?
For me, I do a lot of different projects that are very disparate, but they're all kind of connected in my head, and they're connected by some common values or common themes. But they are very different. And I tend to either use different highlighter colors, or I use Evernote a lot. So I'll use like a different Evernote notebooks. But like if I'm reading a book and they mention a particular study, that might be helpful for a book that I'm working on later. It might be helpful for a talk that I'm writing. It might be helpful for something like Facilitating XYZ. So I just really try to like make sure that I tag that idea for the particular project or for the particular like way I want to implement it. but that's it. So it's very, a book, I might end up with like thoughts or ideas for 5 different things, like for a curriculum I'm writing, for a talk, you know, whatever, or I might end up with nothing, and it's just a good book that I enjoyed.
Right.
But that's this assistant I've done that I've found helpful, because otherwise when I, like, you know, 2 months later, I'm working on that curriculum that I was writing, and I was like, oh, there was that book, and I can't remember what book it was. And then if I do remember what book, I'm like, oh, I got to reread the whole book. So I'm like, nope, that idea is just not going to be included. That's too much work. But I like the yes and yes but thing. I think I will give that a shot, because I love any sort of a framework to try to like look at a text different lens.
Yeah. I think that I'm still developing my system. Like I'm always looking at systems, and like there's somebody who writes every quote from a book that they find useful on a note card, and like and at the end of the book, they'll wait 2 weeks and go through the book again and see if any of them still resonate. Because after 2 weeks, you're like, oh, that was cute then, but it doesn't actually matter now. Yeah. And I've been wanting to use that one. What I am with you in the, like, I have to write in books. Like, I was trying to do the whole library thing, and I have found that, like, I love libraries for audiobooks, but I have to be able to like note take, and I have to be able to like write in it. Mm-hmm. So for me, that's what I do. And honestly, the thing that came to mind was that I have a problem where I can't read a book without being like, how does this relate to social justice facilitation? Like, right? I can't read any nonfiction, or sometimes even fiction, but I definitely can't read any nonfiction without being like, ooh, that's an activity. Like, the amount of questions that I'm like, ooh, that's an activity is like pretty high. So for me, it's more like, how do I not exhaust myself by trying to figure out all the different ways I can use this material, and like balance out like, oh, this is such a rich like text for material, and then just like, I want to enjoy reading this and like find it impactful in the moment. So that's something I'm always trying to balance. And I find when I can write in the book, I can be like, come back to this later, or like XYZ next to it, and not have to do that in the moment. If it's a library book, then I feel like I've got to copy it down and take a picture, and
totally. So. Yeah, I hear you. I've definitely gotten into some like digital books, you know, like Kindle, and yeah, pros and cons with that, because I want to write in them. But I also started using Evernote actually when I was working my PhD, and I had the same issue you were talking about, Sam, as far as like, I know I read this, like I could almost quote it verbatim. I don't know what page it's on. I don't remember what book it is. You know, and that's when I was looking for a system, and I stumbled upon Evernote, and I'm like, this is genius.
Yeah,
it was amazing.
Amy, so what Meg was just talking about, do you ever find, so you're an advocate for creativity. I don't know if that'd be how you describe yourself, but you clearly are, and you help others facilitate creative processes. Do you ever find that you get like idea fatigue or creativity fatigue with your own facilitation or your own work? Like, do you find yourself maybe struggling or spending too much time in one of these cycles? And if so, like, are there things that you've found that have been helpful for you to work through that personally, like as a facilitator and as a business owner, as a like solopreneur is a word that I heard recently that I think is cute. How do you work through that?
Yeah, you know, I think I kind of struggled with that a little bit in this last year, because actually like a year ago, last May, I finished my PhD, and the PhD process, especially in the last couple years, is just like producing, right? You know, you're just like idea, develop it, implement it via paper writing, you know, dissertation. And, you know, I mean, I finished last May, and I was exhausted. And actually, up until then, I had been doing my podcast every week. I think I like in 1 year, I did 50 episodes, so I might have missed like 2 weeks. And then that summer, in 3 months, I published 3 episodes, because I was just like so tired, and I just couldn't make myself, you know, record an episode. And I think I also had this mental like, oh, I got to 50, that's good. But I found that what I had to do was just stop. Like, I didn't make anything, and I just took a break. And actually, my brother, who's an artist, I interviewed him last week on my podcast, and we were talking about the value of being bored. Yeah. And during my PhD, I was also had my business full time. And so every weekend was spent working on the PhD, and the fun level in my life was pretty low. And so then, like now, I mean, even still, it's been a year. I'm like, oh, like I have the whole weekend. Like I could do anything. And there have definitely been weekends, like the entire weekend has passed and I didn't really do anything. Like I maybe watched some Netflix or, I feel like, and then sometimes Sunday night, I'd be like, oh, I wasted my weekend. And at the same time, I also feel like I kind of needed that. Like I needed that boredom, and I needed to just like not worry about producing or making things or being creative. And what's interesting is that now my partner, my wife and I, we're actually in the process of the very beginning stages of creating like another deck of like these Climer cards.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so they'd be like a different variation. We have a few ideas in our head. We haven't like done anything with them yet other than talk about them. But I can see myself having more energy now to create again. And so I think, yeah, just like give yourself permission to be bored, like do nothing sometimes, not all the time, but if you need a year, or like I just did some completely different type of creative projects. Like I refurnished this dresser, which I knew nothing about, and so sometimes just doing something completely different was really helpful. So
are there thoughts on how that might, so with facilitators who do experiential ed or social justice facilitators or leadership program, whatever, like thinking about like the broad swath of facilitators, are there thoughts on that, how that idea might apply to folks like time in the facilitation or in the room, or thoughts on how you've started to think about that in the way that you interact with groups?
So I don't think I know what you're asking. Can you say that differently or say it again?
That idea of like, so the fatigue that you've experienced, and then maybe the solution to that fatigue, that idea of creating space for boredom, or even that idea of like the dresser, like any thoughts on like little nuggets that you might be applying to your facilitation, like in the room, as well as in the more meta, like how you navigate your life as a facilitator professional?
I mean, I think, yeah. Okay. So I think even as simple as, if you facilitate the same thing over and over, you're going to get burned out. And, so even just like either stop altogether, take a break, take a month, 2 months, I don't know, whatever's appropriate, or go to something completely different. Like go to a visual facilitation class, or, where it's just like, whoa, this is a completely different type of facilitation. Like we're facilitating with markers and we're drawing, and whoa, this is weird. It's really cool. And so something like that just can kind of energize you. And then I think, it goes back to what we were talking about before of like, how do you keep, making your podcast better, the show better, and that iterative process. And I think, when you can get like those different inputs and those different ways, different ideas, then you can come back. And if you allow yourself the time to like, say there's a workshop you've done 50 times the same way, and you get this new input and like, you know what, I'm going to revamp this entire workshop. And I feel like that can give you a lot of energy, a lot of, kind of, I don't know, revolutionize or revitalize. That's the word. Revitalize, your practice.
Yeah. That's a great answer. Yeah. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but I was curious as to how that would come out. And that I found that very interesting and very useful.
One of my questions is, so if, so you have like a really awesome, like a model that you love and a process that you do with a lot of different groups, and the power of that is kind of like endless, right? Like you can do those activities in that model and see it like work in so many different potential ways. One thing I'm wondering is like, how do you decide to change something in a workshop or to like iterate your workshops? Like how do you get creative with your workshops in the sense of like changing them or trying new things constantly? And if you do change things, like how do you go through that process of like deciding when to change something up, before a workshop, during, whatever jumps to mind?
Okay, I'll start with the before the workshop. So I have a program coming up in June where it's kind of a unique situation where I've been hired by a family and they're starting a foundation. And they've made a lot of money through they had a business, they've made a lot of money, and they're like cutting to the point where they don't know what to do with it. So they're starting this family foundation. And they've invited me to come in and facilitate them to help them figure out what's going to be the focus of the foundation, which, cool. Yeah, it's really cool. And I worked with the parents once before on kind of a similar but slightly different project. And so it's just like 2 parents, 2 adult kids. And then one of them, the daughter, is like my contact, the one I've been working with. And so we met on the phone the other day, and I'm talking through kind of the process. I'm using the creative problem solving process. So we'll really be spending a lot of time clarifying, ideating, a little bit of developing. And I was talking through some of the clarifying like questions that I would ask. And it was great because she was pushing back and she was like, I don't know if that's the right question. And we had a good conversation about it. And what I found is some of the questions that I was planning on using, which I'm totally changing it now, weren't actually my questions. So for instance, one of them is from a book whose title I'm forgetting, but the author is Tim Herson. And his question is, what's the itch? Like, what's like the thing, that's bugging you, right? And in talking with her, I realized like not only was it's not the concept's fine, but it's not worded right, And so that's something that I need to sit down, and I want to sit down and just like think through like, okay, what is going to be the right series of questions for this process? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So as far as like before, I used to, like earlier in my consulting practice, I didn't spend a lot of time with the client ahead of time. They would invite me to come in for a training and I'd be like, yeah, I'll put that together with you. And then I would show up. And sometimes it bombed because I did something that they didn't like, or, and so now I spend a lot more time, just walking through like, hey, here's what I'm thinking. I want to get your feedback. And so getting that feedback ahead of time, I found is valuable. Which is interesting because if you are at all from the world of outdoor education, that is not the norm in that world. And so, for instance, a group shows up and they want to work on a ropes course, they're going to do a day on the challenge course. It's very common that you don't share with them what activities you're going to be doing ahead of time. And even when I was managing a challenge course or kind of like working with, more of like administrative role, and watching, sometimes the client would say, well, can you tell me what activities we're going to do? And they're like, no, we'll just kind of, we'll show you the day of. And I'm seeing now like, okay, maybe that works in some cases, but that actually can be better if you walk the client through it ahead of time. And not the whole group, but just, your contact person.
That the mystery like isn't necessary for the success.
Yeah, especially for the contact. I mean, you can be very clear and say, don't share this with everybody. But even sometimes if you do, so what,
Yeah.
I don't think that mystery is always important.
Mm-hmm. So that's a difference between challenge coursework and the work that you're doing now. What's something from challenge coursework that you find that like, if you didn't have that background, you would be doing something different now, but maybe in a bad way? Like, what's something that you really value from that time that you're bringing into your work that's not ropes based, or that's not necessarily like physical challenge based?
So I have this little, like this theory that I've developed or whatever. Maybe I'll draw again.
All right, let's do it.
You like the drawing?
Yeah, we can see the whole cycle right now. So we got that all in picture.
I lost my eraser.
I think it might have just dropped.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll use the tissue.
Cool. I thought you were going to use your pillow as an eraser. I was like, dang, that's next level.
Dedication. Okay.
This is what dedication looks like.
Let's see.
Yep.
You're right there. Okay. So we're going to say this is like the left side. This is the ropes course.
Okay.
And continuum, we'll stop it right there. And this is what I think of as traditional like corporate training.
Okay.
Okay. And okay, we'll get rid of all this stuff. Okay, so I think what the ropes course is really good at is providing experiences for people. So I don't know if all listeners know what a ropes course is or what a challenge course is, but you basically show up and there's a series of these different like team building challenges that the group would go through together. And so really good at providing an experience, and the facilitator usually is really good at reacting to that experience and facilitating a conversation. Wait, let me say that differently. Facilitate a conversation that is a reaction to the experience. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, so we have like a reactionary debrief. On the other end, you have corporate training. Okay, let me back up. Let's say that the group is working on like conflict. They want to figure out how to be better at conflict management. So they come to the ropes course thinking they're going to learn that. But what ends up happening is maybe there's an experience that incites some conflict. And so then the facilitator can talk about that conflict. And okay, what did you do? How did you respond? Blah, blah, blah. Over here, the traditional corporate trainer might present a model of like, here's what happens when people have conflict, whatever, and teaches them that model. And with the idea that, okay, I'm going to present this to you, and then you're going to go off into your world, into your work, and you're going to magically use it. And it doesn't work, right? Because by the time you get to your desk, you can't even remember the model. So, but I think the problem over here with the ropes course is it is so reactionary that sometimes we need like a model to kind of hang things on. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So what I try to do is like get into this sweet spot in the middle, and that like I'm presenting a model of like, here's how, here's some different ways that conflicts show up or whatever it is I'm sharing, and then providing an experience to help them apply that right away. Maybe this presentation of the model would be 10 or 15 minutes, and then the experience might be like 45 minutes, so maybe like an hour total that we're looking at this.
And would you then allocate, so in that 45 minutes, is that also the debriefing time of the experience and like the making meaning time?
Yeah, I mean, it just depends. I mean, those numbers I'm giving you are arbitrary. Well, except for that, I try not to present for more than about 10 minutes before there's some sort of like debrief or conversation. But yeah, the actual experience would be, anything. And you know how debriefs go. I mean, sometimes it's 10 minutes. Sometimes it's like, this huge, rich conversation that lasts 45 minutes that you're like, okay, forget the next activity because this is way more important.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's one thing that I've learned from like the world of outdoor ed that I've brought, into the like indoor work that I do now, if you will.
I love the idea of calling it indoor facilitation. I remember that coming up in the phone call we had beforehand. It was like, well, like indoor facilitation. And I was like, yes, I love how everything is relative to like just what other framework you have.
Yeah, right. Isn't that funny? Whereas most people would be like, well, of course it's indoors.
Right.
Yeah.
Where else do you facilitate?
Above water facilitation. Like, what other kinds of facilitation are we doing here?
Yeah, right.
Scuba.
Yeah.
Yes. For some people, gosh, we got to interview a scuba facilitator. It's got to be a thing.
I just met somebody.
Connect us with
okay.
Please.
I don't know if they're actually facilitating underwater, but they are using scuba as experiential education. So
cool.
That's rad.
I have one more question about this. Meg, are you good if I ask one more?
Yes.
Yeah. And it's kind of in relation to the scuba thing, but so you started out by telling us about this like really broad swath of people that you facilitate with, and you were talking about how like health educators or health professionals and corporate professionals and educators, they're all people, and that's like the common ground. If you were to focus on the differences in those groups or something that you've learned from facilitating with those different groups, what have you learned that helps you go into those different spaces better prepared to not just the similarities, but the differences that are important? Like what helps you go into those different spaces a little bit more prepared? And what might you advocate for other people, or like what advice would you have for somebody who might be working with a different population for the first time, of like what they could do with the client, what they could do self-prep, whatever it might be?
Mm-hmm. I think Well, I'll just talk, like, give some examples of some differences that I've noticed first, and then kind of go into, like, what to do about that. I'm going to turn this just because it's a little more comfortable standing here. I'm standing, and I have a stand-up desk, so I'm, like, on this mat. Anyway. Okay, so as far as differences, a couple things, like, just some examples that come up. So there's a technology firm, like a software development firm, that I've worked with a handful of times over the last few years. And one thing I love about them is that they're just, like, into stuff, you know, like, whatever I present, like, I present this and they're like, oh yeah, I mean, that's cool. Like, they're just very open. They're willing to try things. You know, they're in the Midwest, so they're not, like, in Silicon Valley, but, you know, I think have some of that kind of stereotypical, you know, creativity, if you will, like, inherently. I was thinking the other day about this group that I worked with a few years ago, and it was, like, all, like, secretaries and office managers in a bureaucracy. And so it was a group that did not feel very empowered. And that definitely created some interesting dynamics because they weren't the one that brought me in. You know, there was, like, you know, it was someone's manager. It was like, oh, well, these people need this kind of training, right? So their openness to me and their interest in what I was doing was very different than, say, that tech firm, you know? And sometimes I think that that openness is one of the biggest factors that impacts what the day's like, you know? And sometimes it changes, like, within the group. Like, I was working with this pharmaceutical company, and there's this one woman that just, like, she just, like, in her heart, at the core of her, she believed that her job was to do what she was told. That was it. I'm here to do what I'm told. Whereas other people, same job, same company, are like, cool, what else can I do? Like, how can I contribute? And they have this very different outlook. And so sometimes that, I feel like, can be tough to manage in the same group. But I think as far as, like, what I would do to prepare is having conversations with my contact ahead of time. And asking, like, okay, well, tell me about the group. What is the group like? And I think it's sometimes hard for people to actually be accurate in describing a group that they know or that they're a part of, and that they will either, like, put the group up, like, oh, this is a great team, like, we really get along well, we're awesome, or, like, the complete opposite, and they'll say, like, oh yeah, we've got some serious issues, or, like, there's this one person, just wait till you meet them. And I have to kind of try to filter all that because I've made mistakes by just taking that information at face value. You know, and it turns out, like, this one person that they can't stand, like, I'm like, this person's amazing, you know? Or they thought this group was amazing, and actually, like, wow, there's some basic stuff here that they don't know how to do.
Yeah. Do you have any, we've experienced that in so many ways. Do you have any tips or tricks that you've had for cutting through the gossip and getting into the actual, like, useful information? Or are there specific questions you've found, or even, like, indirect questions that have given you, like, really useful information and kind of filtered through that noise?
I mean, depending on the group, sometimes I'll do an assessment ahead of time, like, just a, you know, computer-based paper pencil assessment. One of them that I've used, it's with, it depends on the group. I haven't used this a ton, but Patrick Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. Do you know this book?
Mm-mm.
Oh, love this book. Amazing model. I can be happy to draw the model for you if you'd like. Since we have the chalkboard. But basically the premise is there's, like, these 5 things that teams need if they want to perform well and, you know, be high performing teams. And, you know, it's the kind of assessment where everybody takes it, it asks questions about the team, and then, you know, you can compile the results. I usually would only do that if I'm going to share the results with the team, if we're going to, like, get into that. But it can help me in preparing. And then I've actually developed an assessment tool in my PhD program, which the tentative title right now. This is going to change in the future, but it's called the Creative Synergy Scale. And so it measures like these 3 elements that teams need if they want to be creative together. And so if I see those results, I know like, okay, we need to spend a little bit more time in this area or in that area. So that can be really helpful because now I'm getting the information from everybody versus just this one contact person.
Yeah.
That's great.
One question I asked recently, which I found relatively helpful, was they were like, oh, everybody's great. And I was like, okay, just tell me about like the culture of your company, or like, what are phrases or frameworks that I should know about like your company? And all of a sudden there was so much more that I was like, oh, okay. So though, like ideally these are people who have that frame of reference shared, which was like, I think a little more helpful than just like, who are they? Because they seem to, everyone wants to put on rose-colored glasses, or has just so much personal bias that it overloads. I have one question that's sort of a follow-up to this, because I felt like a lot of what you were saying was really useful kind of ideas or thoughts or ways to think about interacting with a client beforehand. Are there any things you do when you're in the room? So one of our guests on the show previously had basically said, like, when I ask for a volunteer and nobody goes, I'm like, all right, I know where we're starting from. Or if like 10 hands go up, it's like, okay, cool. I know like what kind of group this is. Do you have any like, like a weather vane is the word that's coming to mind. But like any barometers that you use, especially at the beginning of a training, where you're like, this is helpful for me to realize like what kind of group I'm working with, that you do in the room?
I know I do, and I'm blanking.
Okay.
Well, okay, a couple of things come to mind. This isn't right at the beginning, and I wouldn't do this with every group, but there are certain activities that I've done so many times that I use them as barometers. So for instance, the activity Key Punch, I don't know if you know this activity. It's like an experiential ed. No. Okay, it doesn't really matter, but it's just this like, team building activity. And I'm sure I've done it 100 times. And so I can tell, because I've seen it so much, I can tell kind of like where the group's at. How well are they listening to each other's ideas? Are there certain people that are dominating? Are there others that are quiet or ignored completely? I can get that kind of sort of assessment, that feedback from watching them do this activity. One of the things though that I do, if I do get in a certain situation and I find that like, I don't know what to do, or it's like a little bit of a disaster, which inevitably happens, right? And I got this advice from a mentor who worked at UNC Charlotte. His name's Sandy Cohn. And I saw him actually being interviewed on a panel, and he was asked this question of like, what do you do when you're stuck? And he said, he just says to the group, here's what I'm noticing. Like, hey, here's what I noticed. I noticed that these two people talked most of the time. Like, did anybody else notice that? Or it might be like, here's our situation. I'm not sure how to proceed or what we need to do next. Here's what I'm kind of, and just like being super transparent with the group. And then I think it sort of helps the group know like, oh, you're seeing the same things we're seeing, or maybe not. Like maybe you're seeing something totally different. Like either way, it can be really valuable. And so after hearing that, I only heard that a few years ago, and I was like, oh yeah. And I've tried that and it totally works.
What happens after that?
I guess, obviously it varies, right? But I think a lot of times just naming it, like, hey, here's what I'm noticing.
Okay. And
then I often will intentionally ask a close-ended question of, do you notice this too? Or like, did you see this? So it's like a yes, no answer. And then if they say yes, then I can like, oh, okay, well, what does that mean? Or say more about it. And if they say no, then maybe I'll dig in a little bit more with what I'm noticing, or maybe some people say yes, some people say no. And that and alone is some really interesting, content or whatever. Yeah. So it's really just, I think, a way to start a conversation.
I think that's really helpful, because I think I've heard that advice from a couple different people, just like the naming what you notice. And I think especially as like a relatively young facilitator, both in like experience and in age, but it's an intimidating amount of open-endedness, right?
Yes.
Like you're like, I'm inviting so much possible into this space. And I think what you said helps it feel less like, ah, right? It's like, no, I love the close-ended question for that reason, because it's like you are controlling what's about to happen.
Yeah, there's this little tiny book called Open to Outcome. Have you seen this book? It's in the next room. I would grab it, but it's just this little like, 3-inch by 5-inch book, really skinny. And at least I hope this is the right book that I'm thinking of. I need to check my Evernote notes. But anyway, there's like these 5 questions that they propose as like, this is the ideal debrief. And the first one is something like, did you notice blah, blah, blah. And it's a yes, no. And I think it's a great use of like the close-ended question to help you get to a deeper place. Because usually we're like, oh, all questions have to be open-ended. Like, well, actually, no. Here's a good example. So anyway, that's the resource.
That makes a ton of sense. And because it's once they've said yes, you're like, awesome, you agree with me, let's explore that, right?
Right. Versus
like just saying, what did you notice? People are like, I haven't agreed that I noticed anything yet. So
right.
Yeah. You're closing that opt out, which is awesome. That was great. Awesome. Okay, so we have the last kind of like segment of the show. We have a couple of questions that we ask all of our guests, just because we like to see the variety of answers. The only thing that's different is that we won't ask any follow-ups, and like we won't dig in. We will do our best to bite our tongues and not dig into your answers. So nothing needs to change on your end. Just know that that's what's changing on our end.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
I'm nervous.
Okay.
Jerome.
First
kidding.
question. What are 3 words that you would use to describe facilitation?
Open, listening, and questions.
Nice. Okay, if you could pick one ground rule to apply to the entire world that everyone would have to follow, what would it be?
Oh man, there's so many good ones. I think I'll go with what I've heard of as the platinum rule of treat others how they want to be treated. I think that would be pretty awesome.
Sweet.
Sam's a fan.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm like a.
Yeah.
You're like, I'm not supposed to say anything.
What is something Okay, what is something you still need to be reminded of as a facilitator?
Oh man, so many things. I think when I'm in that role of facilitation, to be reminded that I am a facilitator, and that could come in a number of ways, but sometimes like I want to jump in and like contribute to the conversation. It's like, no, it's not about me. It's about them. It's always about them. Can I say one more thing? I guess maybe going along with that, but the power of the paraphrase, I think, and a good paraphrase, not like, oh, so what I heard you saying was, and then like being a parrot and repeating it verbatim, but actually like a true, like, paraphrasing sometimes before I respond to what I think they said. Anyway.
What do you do right before a facilitation?
Like the 5 minutes before or whatever? Is that what you mean?
However you want to interpret it.
Oh. If I'm like going somewhere to facilitate, I like to, which I guess is always going to happen because people aren't coming to my house to be facilitated. But I like to go early, like to be there an hour early. I really like to have like to set up, to just like be in the room, get familiar with the space. And then my ideal is that I'm completely set up as people are showing up. And then as they show up, I just talk to them. And for me, like having those just quick introductory conversations before we actually officially start, it helps me feel more connected to them. It helps me kind of feel more comfortable, like, oh yeah, this will be good. Or, you know, or at least I know a few names, and then that, you know, I might use people's names in the first like 1 minute, you know. So
what do you do right after a facilitation?
I mean, I guess like the obvious, you know, cleaning up and all that. You know, sometimes people want to talk afterwards. And so I try to kind of build in space for that, because I think that that's important if people want to just like check in or like follow up with you. And so I try to provide some space for that. And then I'm usually really tired. I feel like it takes a lot of energy, especially if it's like a full day. And so, you know, I don't know, it kind of depends. Sometimes maybe going for a walk, or just like, you know, zoning out, or going to read a book, or but generally some sort of like either quiet alone time, or if at the most like one-on-one time. Yeah, I tend to be more introverted, so.
Okay. What is a piece of facilitation advice you'd like to give your 5 years ago self?
Okay, I'm like, when was that? 2012.
Yeah.
I think, you know, and I said a little bit about this earlier, but I think it would be being willing to ask more questions before I start, like to engage with the client more ahead of time, and to talk with them and find out like what do they need. And I think sometimes I felt like I was bothering people, and I don't feel that way as much anymore, especially because I've had some clients who are just like, you know, giving me so much time, and I realize that's helpful for them, that it's really, you know, valuable for them too. So I think talking, you know, kind of doing that like assessment, I guess, ahead of time.
What still stresses you out as a facilitator?
Planning the clarify stage I mentioned earlier. No, I think just, you know, always that question, like, is this the best thing for this group today? You know, and just, I think the challenge of facilitation is you never know what's going to happen. Whereas like if you're giving a keynote speech, I know with more certainty what's going to happen, because like I've got this speech planned out, and yeah, the group might be different or their energy might be different, but there's not as much unknown. Whereas with facilitation, man, I mean, that's sort of the challenge. There's so much unknown. So sometimes that definitely stresses me out.
And what do you do to manage the stress?
I think, you know, trying to remember some of those things, like in the moment, I can always say, hey, here's what I'm noticing, or here's what's happening. Or actually one of the, like, sometimes I'm like, guess what? I think we should take a break now. Usually we're like, yeah. I mean, I don't want to take a break like right in the midst of some heated conflict, because sometimes that's more awkward. But sometimes it's just like, let's just reset. You know, like if we're kind of stuck on something and we can't figure it out, like go take a 15-minute break. And that's a helpful break for me. And then sometimes during that break, I'll check in with the client. I don't know if you all find this, but sometimes I find that I can't tell how it's going in the moment. And that like because there's so many things that I'm tracking in my head and trying to figure out, like, you know, manage all these different types of energy, my own and theirs. And like I'll think something's maybe not going that well or going okay, and then I'll check in with the client at the break and be like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. I'm like, okay, cool. That's good to know. We're going to keep going, you know? So yeah, that's sometimes a struggle.
What is a unique place you've facilitated?
I would say on a ship. that was traveling around the world. Yeah, 2011, 2005 and 2011, I worked for an organization called Semester at Sea. And yeah, got to travel around the world. The second time was around the world. The first time was in Europe and Russia, but I was on a ship with about 600 college students. And there was a lot of facilitation of varying forms throughout that.
Sweet. I'm wondering if that's what you were mentioning.
Yeah.
Okay, what's a not directly facilitation related experience that you think every facilitator should have?
Ooh. I think, I mean, this is a little bit general, but I think it's to, as an adult, put yourself in a situation where you are learning something brand new, like whatever that is, and maybe something that's pretty different than what you've done in the past. You know, if it's like going canoeing and you've never done that before, or you know, taking a certain type of art class or something. I think just like being a beginner again can be really helpful.
For sure.
Awesome. So you have recommended quite a few books in the course of our chat together, but I'd love to know, are there any other books that you recommend most to others?
Like the book that I recommend most to other people?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the first thing that's coming to my mind is the book The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. And I would say, I can comfortably say this book changed my life. It's not about facilitation. It's about being creative, but it's really about looking at your own internal creativity and kind of pulling that out, like reclaiming it. And I happened to stumble upon it when I was like a year after college. And I would say it made such a big difference in my life in many ways. So, and I know a lot of people that own the book and have only made it through chapter 2 because the book is set up in weeks. Like there's 12 weeks. And so people may get to the second week and they're like, oh, I haven't done the activities. So they don't read on. And so if you're one of those people listening, I would just say, keep reading. Even if you don't do the activities, although the activities are, of course, what makes it so valuable, but still there's so much good stuff in that book.
Cool. And finally, oh no, not finally, penultimate. Question. Yeah, penultimately, as one says, do you have any online resources that you think others should check out or they'd benefit from?
Definitely my podcast. It's The Deliberate Creative, and it's on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher. You can also get it on my website, and my website address is climerconsulting.com, and Climer is CLIMER. So that's a good resource. I also, on my website, I have a resource page of books, but it is like horribly outdated, but it is a project right now that I'm working on. So hopefully, if you're not listening to this live and you're hearing it later, it will be updated in the next, sometime in summer 2017. And there's also a blog on there that I have. So I started blogging only recently. That was a post-PhD project. But I have a few blog posts about like resources and books, and I try to, like, when I can, like, give away free resources. And so some of the podcast episodes I have, there'll be like, downloadable cheat sheets, or I have like an ebook about climber cards. So those are a few resources.
Awesome. And then one piece of advice you have for anyone who's listening.
You are more creative than you think you are. That's my advice. So go and do something about that.
Awesome.
Love it. Amy, thank you so much. This was really great. Beyond your website, are you active on social media? Are there other ways that people could find you if they want to learn more about you or get in touch?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Amy Climer. I'm on Facebook at Climer Consulting, and I'm on LinkedIn at Amy Climer. Those are the 3 most active. I do a little bit on Instagram, but not that much. So you can find me there and follow me. That would be awesome. And yeah, climerconsulting.com, and then Climer cards. If you want to get a deck of these Climer cards, they're climercards.com. So really cool. There's a ton of ways to use them. The way that we talked about was just one, but they're a great debriefing tool. And yeah, there's some cool like stories on the website you can check out.
Awesome.
Sweet.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. This was a blast, and there's like just such a wealth of knowledge in what you shared, and appreciate getting to tap into that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for putting this together. It's such a cool resource, and I had a great time talking with you all.
Great.
Great.
All right, we're gonna sign off. Thanks for anybody who tuned in, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Bye.
Tomorrow. Next episode is tomorrow.
Yep.
All right. Take care, everybody.